All right, good morning, everyone. The teacher can't be late, so I guess we're starting right on time. Isn't that true? So 9:33, that's when our time says we're supposed to be starting. Good to see everybody today. We've had some folks who've been out either having COVID or being cautious from COVID. We're glad to see many of you back and feeling better, or just other things that have kept people away. We're glad to have everyone here this morning. We're doing our study of history and geography of the Bible, just especially in these first couple lessons, laying some groundwork that will help us as we're getting into some more summaries of specific books or areas or people. We want to just get in a real sense, a layout of the land. We'll be focusing this morning on the land of Palestine and the different names that go with that, the different people who inhabit that land as we're concerned with them in the Bible story, as well as just some other interesting facts and important details to notice about that land as we'll get into there in just a second. Something we've been doing to help us get used to the story of the Bible and kind of having some anchor points along the way have been our 17 time periods. So we want to, again, start with that and review those this morning. So let's start off with finding our rhythm and doing our 17 time periods for review. Number 1, before the flood. Number 2, the flood. Number 3, scattering of the people. Number 4, the patriarchs. Number 5, the Exodus. Number 6, wandering in the wilderness. Number 7, invasion and conquest of the land. Number 8, the Judges. Number 9, the United Kingdom. Number 10, divided kingdom. Number 11, Judah alone. Number 12, captivity. Number 13, return from captivity. Number 14, the years of silence. Number 15, the life of Christ. Number 16, early church. Number 17, letters to Christians. We want to go back and let's just do a little bit of talking about some of our time periods this morning. Thinking about the patriarchs and the Exodus. How do we connect those two time periods? How do we go from what's being covered in the end of the book of Genesis to the story of the Exodus? How do we summarize that connection? So something happens, you're talking about between the two of those?
I think that there's not a written law yet, and then when I think of the Exodus, I think Mount Sinai and the law being given.
So we're moving towards that law, that written law, that, let's see, how do I want to phrase this? In addition to, I'm going to start with that, the Abrahamic covenant or promises that are made to him. Tracy, you got something? Miss Rebecca's got something as well?
I was just going to say, it ends with them in Egypt. The story ends in Egypt.
Right.
The Exodus picks up in Egypt.
The story ends with who being in Egypt? That's right. Jacob, blah, 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 blah. Jacob's family are there in Egypt at the end, and then we pick up with Jacob's family at the beginning of the story, starting to talk about, they start as just 70, 72, but they're growing quickly. So you see that bridge there of talking about the same group of people. Miss Rebecca, something else to add about the connection of these two periods?
It starts with Joseph being sold into Egyptian slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And then he interprets Pharaoh's dreams that there's going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine.
Right.
And during the famine.
Oh, sounds good. Oh, the famine. Yeah, that's right.
Jacob and his family ended up going down there to get food.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, it was God's plan to have them there to
Right.
establish them as a kingdom.
So we could even go back to Genesis 15. God tells Abraham, your descendants are going to be a great nation, or going to be a multitude of people, but they're actually going to be in a foreign place for 400 years. At the end of that, I'm going to bring judgment upon that nation where they're enslaved. They're going to come out of that. And that leads to, God has put them there in Egypt. As Joseph talks about in Genesis chapter 50, he's speaking to his brothers, and they're concerned because Jacob has died. The paraphrase there towards the end of Genesis 50 is, you meant it for evil, but God has meant this for good. Something like that. The idea that God has used the situation for his goodwill and for his plan. And so that plan plays out more into the Exodus. Some of that is going to be them getting back to the land that we're going to be talking about this morning, the land of Palestine, the Promised Land, Canaan land, all the different names we'll refer to, we'll talk about in just a moment. We wanted to, at times, not just go over the time periods, but also say, why are we choosing these, and how do these connect to the periods either before or after. So maybe somewhat random, but at times I'm going to try to pick out some that are relevant to maybe some things we're talking about in some of our sermons, or things that are going to be talked about within our lessons as we go farther along, and we'll try to bridge some of those gaps and keep putting in more points on our spider web to try to fill in and lock in that information. Before we get any farther this morning, as we're all glad to be here today, let's get into our study, starting off with a word of prayer. If you all will pray with me, please. Our Father in heaven, we are so grateful for this time and this opportunity today to come before you. We want to just start off today by expressing our praise and glory to you for the magnificent and awesome God that you are, for being the one who is our creator and sustainer, the one who has shown us yourself through your written word and even through creation and through nature around us. We're thankful for the fact that we have the Bible and for the faith that comes from the facts of the Bible that we study and learn about. We pray that this study of the history and geography of the Bible story will help us to, yes, grow in knowledge and grow in wisdom in our own understanding of the story that we read about in the Scriptures as we are engaging with it on a daily basis. But Father, we especially pray that it will help us to come to grow in deeper appreciation of your plan of redemption to save sinners, to save people who are not yet Christians, to save us, to save our audience and me today from our sins. Father, we pray that you would help us to understand that is really our goal, is to come to know you and to understand this plan in order to take hold of it in our hearts as it gives us hope and it strengthens our faith as we look to proclaim and share that message with others. Be with us as we look to understand the homes and the lives of the people who lived in places far away from we are today and places a long time ago, and understanding the relevance of those places and of those times and how you use them to fulfill your plan and work out your plan and bringing about that redemption through your Son, Jesus Christ. It is through him that we humbly pray this morning. Amen. I want to begin by looking at our globe that I borrowed from Miss Deborah today. We made a point last week that as we talk about the Bible lands, maybe only a few of us, or I think only one of us who were here last week, so we've had the opportunity to visit over there. So just give us some perspective. It can be difficult to try to get a grasp around biblical geography and history. When we think about this is us, approximately, let's Shreveport. That's close enough. We'll be right around there in Texas. And then you have over here the Land of Palestine. And that's quite a distance apart, almost the other side of the world from where we are. And we're not just talking about a place that's really far away. We're talking about a time that's long ago. I mean, almost Star Wars, long time ago, galaxy far away, except we're not a galaxy far away. We're in our galaxy, still on our planet, just on a place maybe a couple thousand miles from us. But it's still a place that's relevant to the people who lived there. We're not just talking about a location that we're just going to look at mountains, we're going to look at rivers just to look at mountains and rivers and think about how pretty some of these things look or to talk about the climate of them. These are people's homes. And one of the points that we talked about last week is trying to understand someone's home gives us a little bit more information about them, but as well as it helps us to understand their strengths and their weaknesses and why they either at times obeyed or disobeyed God. Because when we look at what's going on over here, and where the people of Israel lived, it's not just them, but there are other nations around them. And sometimes those other nations, like people down here to the south in Egypt, or who would be over here to the east in Babylon, or even eventually later to the northwest in Rome, in Asia, are going to have influences on God's people to either lead them away from God, or sometimes as they have been sinning and rebelling against God, God will use those people to punish his own people. So as we look at this land, we're understanding not just places of longitude and latitude, we're looking at people and people that God interacted with. And our focus today is on this land that we're calling Palestine. This is one of the maps that we'll see today, just kind of this general picture. And this is one of those things we talked about last week. If you look at this, and I can use our fancy little spotlight feature that Tracy's already shown off, you can see the Great Sea. You've got the Sea of Galilee, as it's sometimes labeled, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea. If you see those distinct physical features, you're looking at some picture of the land of Palestine. Maybe it's a little bit more zoomed in some places, maybe it's a little bit more zoomed out in some other places. But let's talk about what we mean when we're talking about this land. Maybe one of the earliest names that we refer to this land is Canaan land. We think about that as being named that because of the descendants of who? It might be listed up on the screen up there, but who? Ham and Canaan, and Ham is a descendant of Noah. When would that take place in our time periods? Genesis chapter 11 with not the flood, the other scattering of the people, right? The people scattered, and some of the people scattered to Canaan, as it's later known as, or as it's known as here early on in Genesis chapter 10 and in Genesis chapter 11. This term's still going to be used throughout the New Testament, although this is just one of our terms that we'll see. Later, it's going to be known as the Promised Land, as it's the land that God promises to give Abraham and his descendants. Let's get a little bit of Bible in our Bible class. Open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 12, and we'll see Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, and Genesis chapter 12 and verse 7. Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1, somewhat of an indirect way, God tells Abraham he's going to give him a land when he says in Genesis 12:1, "Go from your country, you and your kindred, and your father's house to the land that I will show you." And later on in verse 7, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." And so God makes a promise to Abraham to give him this land. So a lot of times we talk about it as the Promised Land. The Promised Land, as much as Aggies try to talk about being College Station, is not College Station. The Promised Land is Israel, is the Canaan land. I get that little jab in at Becca and her family when I get to talk about that today. But what's another one of our terms that we can use and kind of synonym to Canaan, to the Promised Land, as well as another term we would use to talk about this area would be something like the Land of Israel. Now, why would we call it, too far, Jeff, the Land of Israel? Catch up. Because the Israelites lived there, right? So the Israelites are who? The family of Jacob. Remember in Genesis 32, Jacob gets his name changed from Jacob to Israel. And sometimes we'll see him called as Jacob still, sometimes we'll see him called as Israel still. But the land of Israel would be the land that belonged to the descendants of Jacob. And so Abraham's grandson, who was renamed Israel. Our fourth name for our land would be then Palestine, the one that is our lesson title for today. Just trying to get familiar with this land and, again, the names of this land and the people of this land. This is a more recent term. This would be maybe even how this land is called or described today. Used after the Bible days. You can see all the facts up here about when Rome was involved in that, and they might have had a part in naming the land this kind of name or using this name for that. Even today, this name is used. So we have Canaan, the Promised Land. We have the Land of Israel, and we have Palestine. All of those being terms that we will use to describe the land of our material. So sometimes we'll be talking about Canaan, and then sometimes in the few minutes later we'll be talking about the Promised Land, and generally we're talking about the same thing. We'll clarify that maybe a little bit and some tweaks in just a moment, but that gives us an idea about the type of the land or the names of the land we'll be talking about. Along with that, we'll be talking about different people in the land, particularly God's people within the land. One of the first references to God's people in the land is when Abram is called a Hebrew. And a Hebrew is just simply a man who is a stranger or a foreigner. In Genesis chapter 14 and verse 13, again, let's get a little bit more Bible in our Bible class. Genesis 14 and verse 13, you can see that it says, "One who had escaped and came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of the Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and Aner. These were aliens of Abram." This is talking about when Lot is captured by some of the kings of the surrounding area. And so he goes to Abram the Hebrew and is going to describe to him who is this, remember, foreigner or stranger. This is not his land, but he is described as a Hebrew here. And that's a term that's going to continue to be used for God's people, especially in the days of the Exodus while the people of God are in Egypt. They'll use that term for them. Some other names for God's people would be Israelites, again, because they're descendants of Israel, descendants of Jacob, and descendants of that family of Abraham. This is used in the Old Testament quite a bit, maybe a term that's preferred by the Jews because it connects them to the promises of Abraham. When we think about the New Testament and how people are very proud to be people who are connected to Abraham, even before them, the Old Testament There's a lot of that. We're the promised people. We're the people that God has chosen. And an Israelite really represents that or calls that to mind or to prominence there within that. So we have Hebrews, we have Israelites, we have the term Jew that's being used for people. Originally being applied to people who lived in the southern kingdom of Judah. Remember, the kingdom's divided in what period? The divided kingdom. Not a trick question there. That's right. The kingdom's divided in the divided kingdom. You had Israel in the north and Judah in the south. This term originally applying to those in the land of Judah, eventually applying to those who, after captivity, came back from captivity. And then even later would be used just for people who identify with this nationality scattered everywhere. This is a term that's used in the New Testament sometimes as well, a term that they would maybe have some connection with too. Again, all of these terms are going to be interconnected and applied as well. So we'll be talking about Hebrews, we'll be talking about Israelites, we'll be talking about Jews. We're generally talking about the same group of people. But as we think about the names of the land, we think about the names of the people within this land, let's talk about the land itself. This is a relatively small country. I mean, sometimes maps can be blown up to show a certain size of things. You might think that's a big scale. But you look at the scale of miles to say, how much space is this actually? We want to really understand that this is really a fairly small country. The one who put this material together in a PowerPoint has made some comparisons to Alabama and Indiana and New Mexico and Texas. That looked out for us. That's very relevant to us here in Texas. But we can get a picture and understand about how small this country really is. We're going to see from our material, if you have the workbook, on the second page of this lesson, that would be page 6, it talks about the fact that 40 of our states are larger than the land of Canaan, which when we talk about Canaan, sometimes we're referring to the land specifically west of the Jordan River, but 40 of our 50 states are larger than this area. So let's look at some connections to other states. So in the state of Alabama, the northern fourth or so, approximately, would be about the size of Canaan. If you go on to something like Indiana, about the top third would be Palestine. I'm from apparently in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, where I am in the northeastern Indiana. I guess we all drowned in the flood or something. I don't know. But if we move on to New Mexico, think about how big New Mexico is compared to some of our other states. Just in that top left corner, about a tenth of the size of New Mexico is the Land of Palestine or this area. And then finally comparing it to Texas, we see it really just pulling up in the Panhandle area. We think about the square miles there, quite a bit smaller than the region of Texas. And this is a fairly small group of people, or it's a really small land space that God uses for a lot of the activity with his people in that day and time. And so as you look at this just in various different places throughout the country, you can see how small this land would be. This is all somewhat to scale. You might not divide it exactly like that, but that gives us maybe at least a picture to say, if I've never been to Israel or Palestine, how big are we talking about? I mean, we're talking about the time it approximately takes to drive from here to Houston. It's about how long it takes to drive from the top to the bottom of Israel. In fact, we'll see some of that more in our next slide as we talk about some of the geographic locations and distances from place to place. So Dan is one of our references to the northern part of the land. Up here at the top would be one of our terms we could use. If we say from Dan to Beersheba, we're talking about from top to bottom. So Dan up there at the top, Beersheba down at the bottom is about 150 miles. Mediterranean Sea up there at the north to the Jordan River is about 30 miles, and then farther down from Gaza to the Dead Sea, 50 miles. These are all, again, facts that if you remember them, great. This is helping us really just try to get a picture of the land and seeing what the land is like as far as the size comparisons to maybe some things we're used to. Canaan would mostly refer to what's here on the western side of this area. Now, are there any of God's people throughout the history of the Bible that are on the eastern side of the Jordan?
Yeah.
Talk about that. Tracy, you said yes.
Oh, no. Wasn't it two of the tribes on the eastern side?
Mm-hmm. Ephraim, Manasseh, and So we had about 2.5 of the tribes who, they're in numbers, decide, hey, we would like to stay here. And that almost leads to a big uproar to say, you don't want to fulfill God's covenant. You're going to just abandon us at this point. But they affirm that we're going to go in, and our men who are able to fight will go and we'll conquer the land with you. And then when we're done, we'll go back home. So some of God's people are going to dwell on the eastern side of the river. And at times we'll see that come up with the story of the judges. Some of the judges are doing their work mostly on the eastern side of the Jordan, as opposed to in their sections of the western side of the Jordan. And even the days of the judges, we're not really talking about judges who walked all of this land. When you talk about somebody like Samson, Samson is mostly down here in the Palestine, Judah area. He's not going to be up here in Dan or even on the east side of the Jordan. Most of his activity as a judge is in that location. We'll get to more of that as we get to those people. Tracy, is that a question, comment? No, very confidently, he says. All right. So we're getting a picture of the size of the country just to put in some of today's terms of transportation. It'd take about 3 hours for us to drive. Depending on who you are, I bet some of you could be challenged to drive that in 2 hours. I won't say who, but I bet some of you probably tried to do some of that. I'm seeing some pretty big chuckles in the back there, Sam Starnes. But anyway, 3 hours for most of us to drive. We drove approximately the speed limit from north to south. This would be something that if you lived in the days of these people, if you had a caravan of camels, you could get about 5 days to go from covering the whole land. 2 days if you had a good camel on your own. But a lot of these people, what was their occupation? What were they doing? Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. They were shepherds. They were herdsmen. So to get a big old flock of sheep and camels and whatever else you have in your herds and all of your people there, you're looking at a couple of weeks to travel around in this area. And for the most part, that's where they're going to stay. I mean, they're not hopping on planes and flying over to Tahiti to hang out for a week or two to just relax them. Most of their travel, most of their life is going to stay within this particular area, besides maybe the occasional carrying off into captivity or the occasional famine that leads them to Moab or to Egypt or to somewhere else around the land, around this particular area. But you're looking at most travel taking just a couple of weeks to get from one place to the next. This is the part, if you're following along in the material on page 6, this is the part we really want to spend some time to focus on and talking about how this land is strategically located. It's a very important country. While it may be a very small country, especially compared to some of our states, you think about a state like Indiana, who cares about Indiana? I'm from Indiana, and I don't really care about Indiana. It's corn and Indianapolis, and if you don't like Indianapolis, then it's nothing. Right, Becca? She's been there with me a couple of times. She knows. We've driven there, and it's just nothing. So you think about this land, though, how small it is. It's a very important, strategically located country. There's major trade routes as it connects Asia and Africa together. So lots of trade routes are going to go. As you draw your maps, and you are going to draw your maps, right? You're going to do your homework for the class and draw your maps. You're going to label some of these trade routes and see they're going right through the land of Israel here, connecting Africa and Asia. There's a great connection to the Mediterranean Sea, and also even some places, it's very close to places like Tyre and Sidon. That's going to be important for some major trade as well. It's very strategically located just from a commercial or trade standpoint. Even lots of world powers constantly going in and out. To the south, you would have Egypt. To the east, you would have Babylon. You'd maybe have to the north, more like Rome or Assyria. All these places constantly going in and out of the land of Israel and interacting with these people, interacting with not just any people, but with God's people. And God uses those people at times to work out his plan or to teach his people lessons or for his people to show their faith and trust in him. And really this point that's made at the end of our section on this paragraph, under an important country on page 6 of our material, Brother and Sister Waldron say, it is no accident that God selected the land, this land, as the promised land for his chosen people. The knowledge of Jehovah could be kept alive in the world as other nations came into contact with the Israelites. Also, it was easy for God to use foreign nations to punish Israel when they turned from him to idols. So it can be very dangerous to play what ifs. So take that into account as we play a little bit of what if in the moment to say, let's say that Egypt is still Egypt, and Babylon is still Babylon, and Rome is still Rome, but God puts his people in northern Canada, and they're there, and that's where God puts Abraham and all the people he's going to interact with are all there. Now, other people are going to be on this continent, and other people are going to interact. But if everything stayed the same through history, as Rome is still a major power, Egypt's still a major power, Babylon's still a major power, but those people not really interacting with God's people in the same way, that could be a very different story. Now, I'm sure God could still accomplish his purpose and his plan, even if, and that's the kind of if when you play What Is with God, God would still make things happen. But God has used this land that's very well connected to other major powers and lots of places where, think about all that Rome, or that Paul could do because he's a Roman citizen, and as he's traveling through the world of Rome to proclaim the message of the gospel. Think about what God does with Egypt at times. When he takes his people to Egypt and puts some of his own people in power and position in Egypt, and how at times when God brings Egypt up to punish his people. As Israel is right there next to Assyria and Babylon and other nations from the east that are right there, God was very clear and easy to bring them in, to show them that they need to put their faith and trust in him and not in the strong nations around them. Think about what happens in the days of Isaiah, when Assyria comes and is knocking on the door of Jerusalem, trying to take it down after it's carried off Israel into captivity. God says, Assyria is not going to come and destroy you or take you down. You are still going to find faithfulness if you will trust in me and understand that I am protecting you right now. There is going to come a time of judgment when Babylon comes, but for now you see that God is protecting his people and showing his power even over the nations around him. So I really think that this is an important point for us to notice and to hold on to and to see that God has chosen this land, seems for a very specific purpose. Of it's not just being it's a great trade route, his people enjoyed some prosperity in the good, faithful years. I think it's more that God is going to spread his message to Egypt. Think about times where we think about references to Alexandria and a lot of work that's related to Christianity from the city of Alexandria. Think about all that happens through the roads of Rome and how every place that goes all over the world at that day and time. Think about even the influence of Babylon. When people from Israel go to Babylon and they work there, they do things and continue to serve God, they bring their culture there. Now, sometimes they get their culture mixed up with Babylon, and that leads to issues, but some people stay faithful, like Daniel, or some people are still zealous, like Zerubbabel, or like Nehemiah or Ezra, and they take those cultures and they go back to serve God in their homeland, learning the things from captivity. That God has strategically used this land or located this land with his people. I want to close this morning with just some things about the climate of the area, some comparisons to maybe what we're just, again, trying to understand the homes or the lives of these people. When you think of Jerusalem, when you think of Israel or Palestine, before we get too far in, what do you think of as far as climate? Are we talking the Bahamas? Are we talking Canada? Are we talking the Sahara?
I've always thought it was hot.
It's hot. It's just, it's in that area in Africa where we see lots of sand, so it's probably pretty hot there a lot of times. Heard some terms of some desert going on in that area. Well, Dylan? Oh, you're just sitting here. Dylan's just sitting here today. We're glad he's there. That's right. All right. Anything else? But what do you think about the land? What do you think about Jerusalem, or you think about the area here in Palestine? It's about the climate there. You can see up here on the screen right now, Joppa is approximately 67 degrees around average annual temperature. That's a pretty mild temperature. What do you got right now there?
It's 54 degrees there. The high today in Jerusalem will be 65. The low will be 42.
There you go. We've got more of a swing here today than they do. They're kind of staying right there in a pretty comfortable. We were in the 20s this morning. We're going to get close to 60 today. They're staying there. It's a fairly mild area. That's pretty close to our degree average there, about 63 degrees. But even just a little bit south, I believe, of Jerusalem, we see in the Jericho, the Jordan Valley, 110 degrees in the summer. So, it definitely does get hot, doesn't it? Think about sometimes that God's people will be wandering around, or they would be in some of this area. They're going to be in some of those really hot places. You think about even some climate that's talking about some places like Mount Hermon. Mentioned in here that Mount Hermon is covered in snow year-round. It's one of the tallest mountains in the area at 9,200 feet. And so that's a very different climate or geography. So when we talk about the climate of Israel, it's not really just a one-size-fits-all. It's not all hot. It's not all desert. There's very fertile areas where there's close to water. There's very dry, hot areas as well. There's very barren areas, desert areas. Think about the times that comes up in stories, like in the Ethiopian eunuch. this land is a desert, or think about other places that that term is used. But still, how that climate affects God's people, we'll get into some of that along the way. Our lesson today is just really introducing the land of Palestine. What are our 4 names for the land of Palestine? Canaan, the land of Israel, the promised land, and Palestine. So those are some of our terms we'll use interchangeably. What are our names for the people of the land? The Hebrews, the Israelites, and Jews. All those terms we'll kind of use interchangeably. We'll try to focus on what terms are most prominent during what period we're in, but sometimes I might be talking about Hebrews. In the next sentence, I'll be talking about Israelites. We're talking essentially about the same people within all of that. And I think what's really most important to take away from this is that God has chosen this area to not just, let's go back to that screen to see that and remind ourselves again, to see that this is a place, I went too far. I think one more. Here we go. It's a place that God uses to keep other nations aware of him through the Israelites, as well as God being able to use them to punish Israel. I want you to really think about that fact and think about how often that comes up going forward. That through the people of Israel, people are also going to know about God. The Egyptians are going to learn about God. How the people of Jericho are going to learn about God. What does Rahab say when the spies come to Jericho there in that first time in that interaction in Joshua 2? We knew that we've heard about your God who's destroyed Egypt. We're aware about you here in the land of Canaan, and we're terrified of your God. And so the people like Rahab, who had faith and fear in the Lord, that led to some salvation for her. Think about when God, again, uses people like Assyria or Babylon or Rome or Egypt to punish his people, that's a very important place for God to accomplish that work. Moving forward, next week, we'll wrap up just a little bit early today, give some time to speak with one another and just chat before we get into our worship period today. Still working on a new clicker, Jeff. Next week, we'll be talking about the little land of Palestine, focusing specifically on some geography of Palestine. Next week is one of our first times we have a map to do. So if you have a book and you haven't already colored in your map and you haven't already detailed your map, this is for your benefit, right? This is not so I can post grades on the back. We're not there yet, maybe someday, but not yet. I'm not going to post grades on the back and say, Ashley didn't do her map. Everyone throw stones at her. That's not what this is about. Jeff didn't do his map. Throw stones at him. This is going to be about for us to try to memorize and to get some more picture to fill in the detail about the lives of these people, the places that these people lived, that God used as we learn more about this particular land and area. We'll start that conversation next week with the part 1 of this in lesson 3. That's all I have for today. Anybody have any final insights or questions or comments about Palestine before we wrap up? Tracy?
Jeff, you had a slide early on that I read something up there that I had not known before, and it was something that the Romans didn't let the Jews to come back to Jerusalem. Was that up there?
That was a law.
So the Romans didn't let the Jews, I didn't realize that.
Let's see. Here in the names for the land, would that be under Palestine?
Right there.
135.
When Jerusalem was rebuilt on totally Roman lines, it was counted as a capital offense for a Jew to be seen in the city. I did not know that. The name of the country was changed to Syria.
There you go.
They wouldn't let the Jews in Jerusalem.
Miss Rebecca and Miss Dean. Mr. Dean.
60 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, I think it's 135. That's just a historical fact that is not mentioned in the Bible.
Right.
Yeah, for a while, they did not allow them back in at all.
Mm-hmm.
And they changed the name from Canaan to Palestine. And they gave it a Roman,
I got you.
a Roman.
So the time frame is after the.
I guess so. I'm learning just as much as you are right now, so which is great. So I'm glad to hear
I
that.
just had not seen that, and I thought, that's interesting, I don't remember that.
Mhm. There we go. Danny, question, comment?
Side note,
Uh-huh.
their seasons are really
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people don't realize that.
They have a winter and a fall and a spring and a summer. Right. There you go. That's true. Something to remember as well. Aaron, is that a hand?
No.
All right. She says no. We'll end on that. We've got a little bit of time. As always, try not to disturb the kids. We'll can get set up for our worship here. We'll start here in just a few minutes. Thank you all for being here, for your participation this morning.